Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome everyone to the Sustainable Wash Systems Closeout event. Today we are going to be transitioning into our final deep dive session of the series on collective action. So welcome for those of you that are just joining us for the event. Thank you so much. For those of you that have been with us since last week, thank you for coming back and returning. We have a question here posted for you. So we'd love to invite you to use the chat to share with us your name, your organization, where you're calling in from. This event has been quite global, and so would love to see where you're calling in from, get a sense of the time zone there. And then what challenges have you experienced with collective action approaches? This will help us kind of understand your own experiences with collective action. So welcome everyone. We have about 16 attendees right now in the room, but we're waiting for, we have over 258 attendees registered for this. So we're gonna spend a little bit of time. You're gonna hear me quite a bit on repeat, but thank you, Jamil and Patrick, for sharing where you're coming in from. So West Virginia, we also have Ethiopia, more from Ethiopia. So Dasta, thank you so much for joining us. Hello, Melissa, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us from Virginia. And this is a great session to learn a little bit more about collective action, particularly as it relates to wash systems. Welcome, Rod. Thank you. Raphael, thank you so much for coming from Switzerland, calling in from Switzerland. Not coming, sadly. Thank you, Amy, for joining us from Washington, D.C. Robert, thank you. Sacramento, very early in the morning, so thank you for waking up early for this event. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the Sustainable Wash Systems final deep dive session, not our final event, but the final deep dive event. So what you're seeing presented here on the screen is just a simple prompt for you to go ahead and use the chat function and share with us your name, your organization, where you're calling in from, and then ideally sharing with us one challenge that you've experienced with collective action approaches. If you have no experiences, maybe share with us what you hope to learn in today's session. So thank you so much for calling in from Switzerland, Sean. Great to have you. More Lamesa from Ethiopia. Thank you so much for joining us. And you highlighted an interesting point around challenges. So frequent change of members is one of the challenges. Excellent. Pierre, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome back, Harold. Thank you for coming back. So we're just going to take a few more minutes as we wait for attendees to log in and get settled. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for our final deep dive session on collective action. We have one more event tomorrow just to kind of tee you up, one more opportunity for you to come back, and it'll be a place where we're going to be bringing it all together and hearing from you and your experiences over the last 2 weeks around what you learned. But today we're going to be focused in on challenges and collective action approaches. Welcome back, Eric. I think you've been with us for the last couple of weeks, so it's great to have you. Willingness for collective action approaches for integration with high interdependency as a challenge. Excellent. Following up on action points is a challenge. Yes. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us from Tacoma, Washington. Even trying to explain what collective action is. Yeah, so you're going to be hearing what the partners, how they define collective action for this project. And I think that that's a very important point. Agreeing on a common vision for collective action. Excellent. Riley from Minnesota, co-creation of common agenda and action plans. Yes, a big challenge. Accountability. Great. These are really wonderful insights. So I'm just taking a look at time. We really want to kind of stay on schedule. So at this point, I'm going to invite Brittany, our Master of Ceremonies here, to transition us into today's agenda. So over to you, Brittany.
Thank you, Katie. Hi, everyone. My name is Brittany Ajrud. I'm the Chief of Party for SWS, which stands for Sustainable Wash Systems Learning Partnership. And I'd like to welcome all of you to our third deep dive session for our Closeout event and learning series. In previous sessions, we discussed tools and methods to engage with and understand systems, as well as professionalized maintenance for rural water service provision. Today's topic is on the use of collective action approaches in WASH. And before we get started, I'll do a quick run through of the Blue Jeans platform for anyone who may be joining us for the first time. And I do apologize if you've heard this spiel once or more. Okay, so this event is being recorded, and we will be sharing the link to the recording in a weekly recap email we send around this Friday. As a reminder, all participants are automatically muted and your cameras are switched off, so you will not be visible in the recording. If you are experiencing any issues with Blue Jeans, just let us know via the moderator chat, and someone from our tech support team will be on standby to answer your questions. You can adjust the size of the speaker video or presentation using the slider at the bottom of your screen. And we will have 2 Q&A segments today. So if you have questions you would like our speakers to respond to, please use the Q&A box. We'll be collecting these for after they finish their presentations, and we'll also have some dedicated SWS partners responding to your questions directly in this feature. You can continue to use the event chat to interact with each other and pose questions to the larger group. Some virtual engagement norms to keep in mind for today's session are to place any devices out of reach just to avoid distractions, to actively engage in the chat box, and some shortcuts you can use are a +1 to indicate agreement, the @ to build off of a comment, or the negative sign to indicate you have a different perspective. And as well as feel free to use emojis to provide some instant feedback. Okay, so as you can see from our agenda here, today is our final deep dive session, and tomorrow we'll be wrapping things up and summarizing our key findings and recommendations for the sector. You should have received a Tap into SWS Learning email yesterday with some primer resources on collective action for today's session. If you did not receive this email, you can let us know in the moderator chat, and we can share a link and also make sure you're on the list to receive the learning note Friday. For today's agenda, we'll provide some background on collective action and SWS research on the topic. We'll then hear a few case vignettes from SWS partners, sharing what this looks like on the ground and focusing specifically on the hub role. This will be followed by a summary of findings from an analysis SWS conducted looking at 11 cases of collective action in the WASH sector. And finally, we have a great panel of experts lined up for the second half of today's session, and they'll be reflecting on our findings and answering some of your burning questions. So we'll put the link in the chat to our Google site if you would like to read the biographies for all of today's speakers. For now, I'd like to introduce our 2 session leads for today. Sean Peabody is a senior learning specialist at Environmental Incentives and leads consortium-wide research on collective action. And Lucia Henry is an associate in the Water Resources and Infrastructure sector of Tetra Tech and leads SWS activities in 2 small towns in Ethiopia, focusing on sanitation service delivery. We will hear from Sean first, so over to you, Sean.
Thanks so much, Brittany. So, as you all know, many governments, especially in less populated areas of low and middle income countries, are behind in establishing robust systems and arrangements for WASH service provision. Major and systematic challenges such as rapid urbanization, water scarcity, and humanitarian emergencies further complicate reform efforts. Overcoming these challenges exceeds the mandates and capabilities of any single entity, ultimately requiring collaborative approaches among multiple stakeholders. Due in part to their recent emergence and inconsistent terminology, collaborative approaches in the WASH sector are understudied, and this gap in evidence as guidance is what we aim to fill with our research. Next slide. So here you can see our learning goal and our learning activities. The learning goal is to understand the benefits, costs, and appropriate uses for collective action approaches. And our key learning activities are to define collective action approaches in WASH, investigate what factors and design decisions can drive progress, capture costs and benefits of different hub structures. So let's dive in and look at the cases. So we were able to include 11 cases in our study, 9 from SWS and 2 from other partners. And you can see these cases here. In Ethiopia, we have Mile, South Omo, Debre Birhan, Waliso, and then Millennium Water Alliance's work in the Amhara region. In Uganda, there's Kabarole, Kamuli District, Kumi, Nakaseki, and National Sanitation Marketing work by Sanitation for Health. And then in Kenya, there's work in Kitui County. So now let's take a look at our first learning activity, defining collective action in approaches in WASH. And next slide. Great. So we developed this definition from a literature review, consultation with collective action experts, and lots of discussion with SWS local facilitators on the project. And where we arrived is this: a process in which a hub regularly convenes sector stakeholders who take joint actions to address shared problems, and in which problems are complex and solutions require deliberation and action by many actors. Members agree on shared vision and problem definition, and stakeholders clarify responsibilities for service provision and hold each other accountable. So if you've got any questions about this or want to learn more, please ask in the chat. I'd be happy to discuss. But I'm now going to hand over to Lucia, who will introduce our case study vignettes.
Good morning, good afternoon. Today, 3 of our colleagues will share their insights on applying the collective action approach on SWS. Each presenter will share the background on their case, the challenges of the hub structure, and the lessons learned. Our first presenter is Elizabeth Buhungiro from Uganda. Elizabeth works with Wave Solutions Limited, where she is the Communications and Learning Coordinator. Our second presenter is Mohammed Musa from Ethiopia. Mohammed works with both IRC and Tetra Tech and is a systems change advisor. Our third presenter is Martin Watsisi from Uganda. Martin is the regional advisor or rather the regional WASH advisor for IRC Uganda. With these introductions out of the way, I will now hand it over to the presenters.
Hello, my name is.
Thank you. My name is
Hello, my name is Elizabeth Buhungiro. I'm Wave's Communications and Learning Coordinator. I'm going to talk about the Wave Nakaseke Public-Private Partnership Collaboration Platforms, which are quarterly PPP review meetings. Nakaseke is located in central Uganda and is one of the 10 districts where Wave has a public-private partnership with the district local government for reliable water supply. Quarterly PPP review meetings were initiated as a platform to build the capacity of the district local government to regulate rural water service provision. In the PPP platforms, everyone has an active role to play. Wave, as a professional maintenance service provider, The district local government is the regulator implementing PPP action plans. The sub-county local government, which includes politicians from lower local government representing community interests and implementing PPP action plans. And then the district hand pump mechanic association representatives who are contracted local mechanics for preventive maintenance and immediate response. There are also representatives from Ministry of Water and Environment. The intended goal of the PPP platforms was achieved. Nakaseke District Local Government is now regulating professionalized rural water maintenance services by providing enabling services. For example, they approved the maintenance fee structure and appointed WAVE as the area service provider. The district local government also issued a pre-works maintenance protocol to organizations investing in rural water infrastructure, such as WASH NGOs in the district, and is now convening regular PPP review meetings. Next slide, please. Okay, so in the beginning, the hub was independent, having low convening power and high capacity. WAVE convened the meetings and other stakeholders attended. The reason for this kind of setup was that there was need to build buy-in through collective decision-making. WAVE convened an initial multi-district PPP meeting during which there was a call to action to district local governments to work with the service provider WAVE to operate a comprehensive rural water supply pilot public-private partnership. The vision was set, and then individual district local governments signed MOUs with WAVE. WAVE also presented baseline functionality results to show evidence of the functionality crisis in rural Uganda. Key performance indicators were also set during initial PPP meetings, and WAVE did self-reporting as part of the process to build the district local government's capacity to regulate. In mid-2019, there was a transition to a supported government hub where WAVE provided logistical support and the district local government convened the meetings. The meeting constituted collective action planning and role sharing. Nakaseke District Local Government appointed a PPP coordinator whose role was to follow up on action plans made during meetings and monitor overall water interventions so that there was coordination and these interventions were aligned with the PPP. Sub-county local governments in Nakaseke signed resolutions mandating every community sharing a water source to have a preventive maintenance agreement and pay annual service fees. This was a result of proof of concept. By June 2019, over 50 communities were already paying for preventive maintenance and were consistently enjoying over 97% functionality, which had never happened before. Currently, the Nakaseke PPP review platforms have transitioned to an institutionalized government hub because there's complete buy-in. As I mentioned earlier, the district local government appointed WAVE as the area service provider in June 2020 and issued a pre-works maintenance protocol to all rural water infrastructure investors in the district at the same time. Next slide, please. We faced two main challenges. The first was dependence on donor funding. And while donor funding is initially needed to support scaling to financial viability volumes, it can also be erratic and this would be disruptive. The second challenge was the government structure for rural water supply is weak, so there is high dependence on personal relationships rather than institutional arrangements. This is also problematic because building buy-in is vulnerable to turnover and individual decision-making power. Next slide, please. This is what we learned. Firstly, it's important to have a clear vision, goal, and collective responsibility. In our case, this was great for consistent attendance because everyone had something to achieve. Secondly, it's important to create buy-in and ownership. We did this by A, creating formal relationships in written contracts with communities to show popular support at scale, and B, involving all tiers of government and working with central government to adopt professional management of rural water supply assurance as a national policy. We also learned that local government has the capacity and interest to provide the enabling services necessary for professionalized maintenance that I mentioned earlier, such as issuing a pre-works maintenance protocol to everyone investing in rural water infrastructure so that there's coordination. Lastly, we learned that establishment of proper monitoring and evaluation of operation and maintenance actors by the district local government is still in early stages and needs support and coordination of international aid donors. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. My name is Mohammed Ibrahim. I'm going to present the challenges and the lessons from the South Ari hub structure. South Ari Warada is one of the 4 sustainable water system pilot areas in Ethiopia. Those are Debre Birhan, Waliso Mille, and South Ari itself. The Warada has a population of more than 280,000. The water sources are mostly from small schemes like on-spot spring, hand-dug well, and shallow wells. Its water access is 26%. Of these, 35% of the rural water schemes managed by water reserve stations, and only 2% of the household connection managed by gas utility. Next slide, please. The South Ari Learning Alliance, established in November 2017, following the discussion on different baseline assessment reports. Members of the coalition are technical staff and decision makers from the government wash sector offices, international and local NGOs, private sectors, and community groups. The Alliance said its vision first in line with the government growth and transformation plan, but later revised to contribute for the achievement of SDG 6 for at least 100% basic wash services. Next slide, please. The collective action startup process first started with initial consultations and assessments. The consultations with key decision makers and wash stakeholders. With the stakeholders conduct baseline assessment in order to start collaboration with the local government and successive discussions on the findings and recommendations. Secondly, formal agreement and establishment of the hub structure, signing of memorandum of understanding between the project and local government, and setting the steering committee from the Learning Alliance members and developing the terms of reference structurally to guide the Learning Alliance activities. Then setting vision of the Learning Alliance and deciding action areas. The Learning Alliance focus areas for South Ari is strengthening monitoring and maintenance of the rural water schemes, the financing of wash services. Lastly, during the journey of the Learning Alliance, all the members of the Learning Alliance implement the collaborative action plan and come back with report of their performance through the leadership of the steering committee. Next slide, please. When we look at the structure of the hub, the Learning Alliance structurally led by a steering committee. The chair of the steering committee is the water of the local government water office. The steering committee decide agenda, date, invite participants, and prepare presentation for the Learning Alliance meeting. Water office as a chair of the Learning Alliance follow implementation of the Alliance plan of action and reporting. The project, that means Tetra Tech or IRC, serve as a secretary for the coalition. The coalition decided to sustain the Learning Alliance without external funding after the closeout of the project after this month, September 2021. The Alliance facilitation role provided additionally to the chair of the coalition, the water utility at Debre Birhan, the municipality at Waliso, and the water office at both South Ari and Mille expected to take the role of the project, that serving as a secretary and facilitating the meeting. Next slide, please. Some of the challenges are the WASH stakeholders at the local government level provide more focus for infrastructure development rather than strengthening system. There is a high turnover, especially on the member of the decision makers. The other challenges are low participation from the decision makers, low accountability for group action plan, dependency on the external funding. Next slide, please. Some of the lessons are collaborative approach help stakeholders to work towards to their shared vision. Collaborative problem identification helps to share responsibilities. Evidence-based data helps to systematically present and convince stakeholders to translate agreed action points into action. Government uptake depends on alignment of recommendations with existing mandate, demonstration of value, and government capacity and funding to implement recommendations. Thank you. Hand over to you, Martin.
This is the case of Kabarole in Midwestern Uganda, with a population of over 300,000, served by over 1,200 water points. Unfortunately, only 62% of these water points are functional at the moment. The hub that we are sharing about is the Kabarole District Wash Task Team, a learning alliance that was formed on March 22nd, 2017 at the District Wash Stakeholders Forum. This has a multiplicity of members from different walks of life, from politicians, civil society, and opinion leaders. IRC is the dedicated hub facilitator of this learning alliance, which is mandated to think outside the box to provide strategic direction for the district to achieve sustainable wash services by 2030. The district task team has achieved greatly in terms of making a proactive and positively contributing politicians in the district towards sustainable wash services, making communities proactively engage their leaders to determine their wash needs, and also building the capacity of the district local government, particularly the district water office, that ranked second in the country in terms of wash service delivery. But the major accomplishment is the district wash master plan, which is a planning tool and is supporting the implementation and allocation of wash resources in the district. How did the district task team select these as key areas to focus on? This was through a systems analysis where local government capacity, political engagement, and community involvement were selected as key focus areas for sustainable wash services. Let me describe a little bit about the structure of this learning alliance. It is a separate entity, but linked to the district council, the highest decision-making entity. IRC facilitates meetings, leads up on the follow-up, and ensure internal learning. But the local government sets the agenda, implements, and experiments on the actions agreed upon. And the members also represent this learning alliance to the different forums where they belong. A few challenges have been faced so far in terms of the turnover, for example, of members, especially the politicians who, through electoral process, some of them are not returned, and some form of dependency, and sometimes looking at it as an IRC team or IRC tool. However, we have ensured that this is well anchored in the district local government to reduce on the impact of these challenges. Some key lessons learned so far are that where there are visible results from the Learning Alliance, that the district is committed to support its continuity, and therefore I suggest that wherever learning alliances like this are formed, they should be formed as think and do tanks to produce tangible results and create local buy-in. Thank you very much. I'll wait for the questions later on.
Thanks, Elizabeth and Mohammed and Martin. We'll now open it up to questions. The first question we have actually is for Liz. It's great, and it's from the audience. It's great to hear about the successes of Nakasaki PPP. I'm curious about if there was much influence by other NGOs, as I can imagine that would have disrupted the work, but don't see it listed as one of the challenges. Liz, can you answer this question? It looks like Liz is having problems connecting, so we'll get back to her on that question. The next question really is for Mohammed. Mohammed, given that turnover was a challenge in South Ari Learning Alliance, what did IRC do to help mitigate the effects of turnover? What advice would you give to a facilitator experiencing turnover in their coalition?
Thank you, Lucia. Yes, turnover is one of the challenges for the collaborative approach. Without keeping the members continuously, there may be difficult to keep the momentum. So, as of course not in South Ari, in both SWS pilot areas, turnover is one of the challenge. In order to overcome this, what the project is doing is keeping members, especially those decision makers, their engagement is of course very important to uptake lessons and action of the coalition decided agreed points. So keeping them updated in between the Learning Alliance, other than the formal Learning Alliance meeting. Of course, the project has a local facilitator at the district level, so the district level facilitators keeping them updated in whatever the condition they got in a formal or in other ways. So for the facilitators, engaging at any condition, engaging the decision makers or the coalition members in any condition is very important in order to facilitate the government uptake and things in doing action. Thank you.
Thanks, Mohammed. I think just to summarize, I think what we're hearing is you're saying that the informal and in-between interactions, or rather the in-between the meeting interactions are just as important as the formal. And this has helped in terms of keeping the members engaged and addressing some of the issues with turnover.
Exactly, yes.
Perfect. Okay, so our next question is for from Rebecca, for both Mohammed and Martin. I imagine that IRC couldn't keep up this facilitation role for forever. How do you see the handover process going? Who would you hand over that role to? And how long do you think that transition would take? And maybe I start with Martin, and then Mohammed, you can answer afterwards.
Thank you, Lucia, and thank you, Rebecca, for the question. I think it's not in a given kind of timetable that we plan to hand over the facilitating role, but IRCs are existing as also a learning hub in the district, and that trust is based on that learning experience, not only just the long time that IRC has been in Kabarole district, but the belief in government, especially as the enduring entity in this particular role of serving the people, is already beginning to play out, that IRC trusts and engages the local government to play a central role in facilitating the learning hub, the learning alliance. So definitely it goes back to government, and already the transitioning is happening by strengthening the government capacity to appreciate and also take on the facilitation of the learning alliance. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. So Mohammed, I think what Martin is saying is that, timelines it is difficult to talk about timelines when we're talking about handing over, but key to the handover is ensuring that this is transition to government. Do you have any reflections on that, or can you also respond to Rebecca's question?
Martin's idea. Trust is very important during our journey of the collaborative approach from the beginning. Engagement of the government, starting from the data collection and identification of the problems, is very important, and creating trust of the coalition, showing them with value, is very important in order to take this coalition or the learning alliance activities. By itself, it is learning alliance. If they learn it good, they build trust with this approach. There is no question they will continue with that. Maybe as a earlier question, the turnover may affect the handovering, but institutionalizing is very important to handover. In our case, SWS is already closed supporting the Learning Alliance activity in June 2021, but we are expecting with this September, maybe, or in October, they will facilitate the Learning Alliance meeting by themselves. So they promised to facilitate by their own, of course, both small towns and rural waradas. Maybe I am sure one South Ari and from the small town Dabra Brahan will continue, depending on their interest and commitment of the Learning Alliance members. The other two, they promised to continue to hand over this approach, but we will see what will happening in the coming months. Thank you.
Thanks, Mohammed. That's super to hear it's super to hear that there's sort of the beginnings of that handover, or at least we're seeing them take the lead in the different SWS towns, and also that you see, you agree with Martin on the need to sort of institutionalize the Learning Alliance. It looks like we have Liz back on. Liz, one of the questions to you that has come in is, and I will repeat this here, it's great to hear about the successes of Nakasaki PPP. I'm curious about if there was much influence by other NGOs in Nakasaki, as I could imagine that would have disrupted the work, but don't see it listed as one of the challenges. Can you respond to this?
Actually, Nakasaki, we
I think we might have lost Liz again. Let's come back to Liz.
It's one of the risks of this working. In Nakaseke, it doesn't have a lot of NGOs offering free prayers, and it was very...
Liz, we can't hear you. We'll have you respond to the question in the Q&A box for now. And then we'll go on to the next question. Thanks for trying to connect. I know it's been difficult. Our next question is from Hannah. And I'm going to pose it to Martin and then to Mohammed. And Liz, if you can join us, that would be great. Would you say that existing government-led coordination mechanisms or networks could be used to facilitate collective action? That is, by influencing their agendas and work plans, rather than creating new project-funded alliances or mechanisms? Martin, can you go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. I don't know who asked that question, but for example, for the case of Uganda, already the district has a district water and a sanitation coordination committee that sits on a quarterly basis for maybe a couple of hours to deliberate about the implementation of water and sanitation in the district. But that was noted by the stakeholders, the WASH stakeholders, who met on a water day, that they could not provide enough time and a consistent discussion and looking around, probing and maybe testing some solutions to the long-term vision that had been created or put before them. So it is the same, some of the members that decided that they needed to incorporate people from different groups and create a team that is dedicated to, that will dedicate more time, research, innovations,
Looks like we might be losing Martin. Martin, can you hear me? Okay, we'll come back to Martin. Mohammed, can you respond to this question? What would you say? Would you say that existing government-led coordination mechanisms could be used to facilitate collective action? The question is from Hannah Crichton-Smith.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Hannah. Yes, there is very important to continue on the existing government-led coordination. But in our case, in Ethiopian context, in some districts and towns, there is a WASH steering committee and the WASH technical team. In some district and towns, there is no. So in the district who already has a coordination mechanism, still we are suggesting to continue or build on it. But depending on the need of the existing coordination mechanism and the project purpose or objective, maybe they themselves discuss and include and identify some missed stakeholders. For example, in our journey, we included academic staffs from Jinka University, small and micro enterprise to support the mechanics, and also community representatives in order to hear
the challenges from the ground level. So, as you said, building the existing coordination is very important, but still there is a need to include the missed stakeholders during the journey, and depending on the agendas they are discussing and the plan they develop to take under action.
Thanks, Mohammed. Thanks for that. I encourage the audience to continue to put your questions in the chat. In the meantime, we're going to go back to Martin. Martin, we have a question for you. You mentioned how IRC Uganda's long history in the area helped give them a convening power needed to kickstart the hub. Can you tell us more about how that helped you? You know, giving you the right connections, etc.
The hub or the Learning Alliance in Kabarole was not the first IRC experience with the multi-stakeholder learning platforms in the district and in the country. So that already gave us some background knowledge about how to establish, convene, and sustain multi-stakeholder learning platforms. And when the Kabarole District WASH Task Team
We lost Martin again, unfortunately. Let's give him a few seconds to rejoin. Mohammed, while we wait for Martin to rejoin, let me ask you a question from John.
Okay.
From John Major. If the key objective of collective actions is mainly to influence government policies, resource allocation, and technical assistance and regulatory functions post-project, as well as policy advocacy, how then is it possible to give leadership role for collective action to government?
Yeah. Of course, the collective action is discussing the challenges of the WASH sector and learning by discussing and evaluating what they are going to do and undertaking by Warada or district and small town implementers. And they come back with reports and the suggestion for the decision makers. Of course, the decision makers, the Warada administrator and the mayor in a small town level, and the Warada administrator at the district level is a member and a chair, a keynote speaker for the Learning Alliance. They sit with the members, they hear what the members discussing and raising ideas freely, what they feel. Of course, there is the alliance is a voluntary meeting, a voluntary members. They are contributing. They came for the meeting voluntarily to contribute for their sectors. So any idea is acceptable. They raise, all members can raise freely what they think and planning to contribute for the sector. So the leaders, as a member there, as a keynote speaker there, hear and take a feedback from the members about the challenges in terms of implementation, the challenges in terms of policy, the challenges in terms of regulation in all aspects of the WASH implementation processes. So the members believe the leaders to take these lessons, these learnings in their higher level meetings. For example, at the Warada level, the Warada administrator meet with the zone level. The zone level meet with the regional level. So they expected to raise this issue, their understanding about the ground level from the discussion of the Learning Alliance in their higher level meetings. And of course, we have a platform, also an opportunity to present lessons from the district level at the regional level as well as the national level.
Thanks for that, Mohammed. Thank you very much. We're now going to actually open it up to, or rather transition to our colleague, Kimberly Pugel. Kimberly will present on the summary of the key findings in this research. Kimberly is at the University of Colorado at Boulder. She is the primary researcher on the collective action work in SWS. I'm just noting to the audience that, we don't have a designated Q&A at the end of the section, but, please ask your questions in the Q&A tab of Blue Jeans, and we will be answering your questions there. Thank you. Thanks, Kim.
Thanks, Lucia. Is everyone able to see my video? Okay, I don't see my video. It's fine. Okay. Great, thank you. Sorry, Blue Jeans. Okay, great. Well, thank you. So, yeah, all of this really interesting learning shared by Liz, Mohammed, and Martin, and all the great questions that they were able to answer was all a part of a larger goal of the SWS partnership, which focused on investigating what factors in design decisions can really drive progress of collective action. Finding the right hub structure was one of the factors that emerged as very important in some of our collective action approaches. I'm going to now go through the rest of our findings at a high level. Next slide. The question we sought out to answer was what combinations of factors contribute to progress of collective action approaches. We collected and synthesized data across 11 cases of collective action in WASH, which included 9 cases from SWS and 2 from outside of SWS, as Sean mentioned earlier. Our data sources included over 100 literature sources, 40 interviews, and 4,000 pages of documentation, which spanned more than 3 years of records. Using all of this data, we investigated about 40 factors to understand the role that they played in driving progress. The comparative analysis started by qualitatively coding all that documentation and converting all the qualitative information into comparative values that emphasize the key differences between cases. And then with those comparative values, we synthesized all of those using qualitative comparative analysis, which is a more structured and systematic comparative method than traditional cross-case comparison methods. It uses fuzzy logic and set theory to pinpoint meaningful factors and highlight the most important trends. Experts from each of these 11 cases, including Liz, Mohammed, and Martin, who you just heard from, as well as a lot of others, all of those experts were highly involved in not just collecting the documentation, but also helping to analyze the data and interpret the results. Next slide. So 5 factors, as I mentioned, 5 factors work together in different ways to drive progress. Hub structure, including how it gained convening power and capacity, was one of those 5 important factors that resulted from our analysis, which is why we spent so much time talking about it earlier today. And if you've been in some of our previous learning events, we've talked about some of these other factors in depth as well. Since each of these 5 factors are going to appear multiple times as I go through the results, I'll take some time right now to define these, but you can also reference them in the glossary of the flagship product. It's the very final page of the document and the report that someone could hopefully put in the chat. If you download that report, it's the very final page. It has all these definitions as well. But to go through them one by one, we have already talked a lot about the hub with convening power, so I'll just start there. And it has a 2-part definition. So first, the hub, as many of you probably know, is the entity that manages all the logistics, facilitation, leadership, and administrative functions of the coalition. And then second, we saw that it was important that the hub has significant convening power. One of the questions to Martin was about that, and Martin had talked about it a little bit as one of the ways that they were able to, really help them kickstart the hub. So having significant convening power means that that entity has the influence and ability to bring people together for meetings and other activities. We saw that the two main ways that significant convening power could be gained. The first is when the hub is a government entity that's respected, has decision-making power, and holds a mandate related to the topic of the coalition. And the second is when the hub is a non-government entity that, like Martin mentioned, has a long history in the area before the coalition began, has strong working relationships, high respect and influence, social capital, expertise, all of those things that really help them form those connections that allow them to bring people together. So that's hub with convening power. Local government uptake means that all the relevant decision-making entities in the local government act based on recommendations made by the coalition. So this could include contributing financial or in-kind resources to the activities that the coalition is set out to achieve. It could mean expanding annual government budgets related to the topic. It could mean passing policies or resolutions. What local government uptake really means is pretty context specific. But at the end of the day, it means that the local government is meaningfully acting to help propel the goals of the coalition. Collective problem identification means that key problem areas that the coalition will ultimately address are defined by the members of the coalition themselves through the collaborative process. This is opposed to the problem areas being defined before the coalition starts and having the coalition focus their efforts instead on implementation and action. External funds for activities means that funding is available to the coalition from external sources, specifically for the implementation of activities, not just for meetings. Some examples of funded activities include database establishment, policy development, master planning, or infrastructure construction. And then finally, continuity and accountability. Some of the challenges people mentioned at the very start of today's webinar was on turnover and establishing accountability mechanisms. And so this factor is really about making sure that the member organizations are consistently sending the right representatives and members feel accountable for actions that are assigned to them. So these 5 factors worked together in different combinations to drive progress in our cases, which I will cover those combinations shortly. But before getting into those combinations, I want to explain what we mean by progress. If you go to the next slide. So we defined the outcome, progress, as the specific activities or action areas that were decided on by the coalition. So such as a fecal sludge dumping site or a countywide monitoring database or a certain policy. That activity both made progress and we wanted to also consider how difficult it was. So we had 2 measures. The first was the degree to which the activities were implemented, considering incremental steps towards progress. So that includes when buy-in was obtained, when resources were mobilized, and when it was finally implemented. And then the second measure was their relative difficulty. Next. We identified 7 aspects of an outcome that would make it more difficult to achieve. That would include if it was unfamiliar, required widespread change, required policy change, was multifaceted, controversial, or was dependent on stakeholders distributed either horizontally or vertically. So, for example, in one town in Ethiopia, implementing a fecal sludge dumping facility was controversial because there was a long-standing conflict about which entities would be allowed to dump at the facility, and its establishment meant stronger regulation of some of the predominant industries in the town. So it was quite controversial. But not only that, it also relied on actors from the health office, the environmental office, the water utility, the sanitation municipality. So it was highly dependent on stakeholders distributed horizontally. Finally, it required policy changes on the part of the environmental office to pass new policies related to fecal waste disposal. Despite all of those challenges and measures of difficulty that applied to it, this case was still able to construct a temporary dumping facility in 2020 and have drafted plans and mobilized resources for the construction of the long-term facility. So these two metrics, progress and difficulty, were combined into a single measure, which I'll just refer to as progress. And out of these 11 cases that we looked at, 8 of them ended up making progress on difficult outcomes, while 3 did not. And those 3 cases in which progress stalled were actually used as counterfactuals throughout the analysis. So their results are reflected in these pathways as well. Great, so 3 unique pathways or combinations of factors explained how cases made progress. In the first pathway shown here, progress was made when the hub had convening power, which, as we've talked a lot about, allowed that entity to rally stakeholders around an effort and ultimately strengthen the continuity and accountability of members, which ensured that members weren't just consistently showing up, but were also following up on action items that were assigned to them. Largely, we saw that cases established this accountability either through activity tracking, such as an annual work plan that everyone agreed to, or by progress tracking, such as through agreed performance indicators. But these 2 factors alone were not sufficient for progress. Government uptake was a critical third piece of the puzzle that allowed these cases to make progress. It's important to note that in this pathway, the cases that were able to follow this pathway benefited from a stable enough political environment that continuity and accountability could be established. In contexts with high turnover or unpredictable political dynamics, for example, some of the challenges that we talked about earlier today, it was hard to gain continuity and accountability. And some of our cases actually weren't able to establish it, but that doesn't mean that cases were not able to make progress. So in our second pathway here, the hub still had convening power, but even if it wasn't able to establish continuity and accountability, they were still able to secure external funds for activities. So then these 2 factors, again, paired with local government uptake of recommendations, was another pathway that was sufficient for progress. And then finally, even though we spent so much time talking today about hub with convening power, not all hubs are going to be able to have convening power. And that's, our third pathway actually shows that that's okay. The third pathway made progress independent of whether or not the hub had convening power. Instead, the hub made sure that problems were identified collectively by the coalition. They were able to secure external funds to fund the solutions that were collectively identified. And then again, local government uptake was the third condition required to make progress in the third pathway. So these 3 pathways together reliably explained progress in our 8 successful cases and 3 counterfactuals, which is shown by the relatively high validity measures that are on the bottom of the screen. In qualitative comparative analysis, I'm not going to get into it, but values greater than 0.8 are generally considered to be strong. These pathways have a lot of overlaps. So you may have noticed that all 3 pathways relied on government uptake. So next slide. As I talk through some of our main takeaways, I'll actually present the pathways in this way, as that really helps to reveal some of the most important takeaways and trends. So the first takeaway is that local government decision makers taking action in response to recommendations by the coalitions was the only factor that was absolutely necessary for progress, and that it was in all 3 cases. So for example, the Deborah Brahan Learning Alliance in Ethiopia was able to construct that fecal sled jumping site in part because they were able to convince the town administration and mayor's office to allocate budget for it. For folks who have worked in the WASH sector for a while, this is likely not very surprising. Water and sanitation services are public services in many places, and most of the time local governments are responsible for that service delivery because of decentralization. And so largely that just means that progress of collaborative or of collective action approaches in WASH specifically, government plays a really important role in that. But even if this is a bit of a straightforward finding, it's still really important because our cases have demonstrated that it's really hard to secure government uptake. Signing a memorandum of understanding does not guarantee uptake, nor does involving government as members in the coalition. Uptake can be challenged by turnover and shifting priorities come election season. And often, in reality, government actors are juggling so many different responsibilities. But these results show that every single effort made by the coalition to advocate and demonstrate value of their activities can all pay off because it can help attain government uptake. So tomorrow, just a quick plug, at the end of the Bringing It All Together event, we are going to have some breakout table discussions. And one of those tables, table 2, will be specifically on strategies that our cases in SWS have used to secure this uptake. So if you're interested in this, come by that table. Next slide. The next takeaway is that establishing a consistent and accountable membership can be one step to progress, which is generally recommended in guidance for collective action. It's not the most surprising. In the WLISO Learning Alliance's 7th meeting, for example, only 1 out of the 25 participants was a first-time attendee, and mostly all members feel accountable for action items that are assigned to them. That being said, we saw that a lot of our cases were not able to achieve continuity and accountability because they didn't have that stability, such as, when they had frequent turnover of government staff or shifting priorities due to emergencies. We've talked about this a lot, and it's a big challenge. And one of our big takeaways is that that's okay. 2 pathways were able to make progress without continuity and accountability. Next slide. The third takeaway is that external funds for activities can really help drive progress, especially in contexts where continuity and accountability cannot be ensured. The South RA Learning Alliance, for example, had access to funding to help set up an asset monitoring system and database for monitoring scheme functionality. We know that this is a bit of a controversial of an idea, both because guidance on collective action typically assumes that the members themselves will be able to front the resources to fund activities, but also because we know in the development sector that funding can sometimes create long-term dependencies and unexpected impacts. But overall, our results are showing that for the first 3 years of a collective action program, funding can be necessary in some contexts, but again, not all contexts. Next slide. And then finally, our last takeaway is about collective problem identification. Again, collective problem identification means that the coalition themselves are identifying the problems through the collaborative process, rather than problems being identified before the coalition forms. The Kabarole District Wash Task Team, which Martin talked a lot about, there in Uganda, for example, they formed with the sole task of helping their district reach universal access to WASH by 2030. All of the task team members brought their unique knowledge and expertise to the table, and with the help of a comprehensive systems assessment conducted by IRC Uganda, which Martin also mentioned, they identified 3 main problem areas that they would tackle to help achieve that universal access. Collective problem identification is generally recommended in guidance on collective action. Some would even say that without collective problem identification, an approach wouldn't even be considered to be collective action. But we saw that even though it was critical in some contexts, it was one of the 3 pathways to progress, that doesn't mean that a program needs to do collective problem identification to be successful. There are still routes to success if a program requires problems to be predefined. So for example, if, in response to program funder constraints or to align with government agendas, problems need to be agreed on before the coalition starts, that's totally okay. And that can be, that doesn't mean that the coalition won't be successful. Next slide. One final note to mention, after going through all these takeaways and going through these 5 factors and their different combinations in depth, there were 13 factors that didn't vary across our cases. And while the lack of variation meant that we weren't really able to look at the role that they played and the influence they had on success, they're still important to acknowledge because they may have helped set the stage for some of those 5 factors that did drive progress. So for example, we talked a lot about the hub today, and, only some of our hubs had convening power, but all of our hubs had capacity. And so having, a hub with convening power may have also benefited from the fact that the hub also had capacity. We just weren't able to look at the role of hub capacity in our analysis. And you can find more information about all of these in our flagship product, but a few important ones to note is that all cases established a common vision. All of them engaged technical government officials and engaged decision makers, which some of our questions in the chat and discussions have been about the role of government. And so, just one thing that's really important to highlight, again, is that regardless of whether they made progress or if progress stalled, all of our cases were engaging government officials. So again, we'll be answering questions about these findings in the chat, and hopefully, I haven't been watching the chat or the Q&A area, but hopefully already some of your questions have been answered. But as we move on to the next part of the presentation today and go through the panel discussion, I and Amy and others on our team will also be answering your questions in the Q&A. So I'll hand it back to Lucia now to go through our very exciting panel discussion. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Kimmy. Thank you very much. We have now arrived at the final section of our program, which is the panel discussion. We're bringing you today to a panel of experts in collective action. They will dive into challenges and mitigation strategy in implementing collective action approaches. They will discuss their key takeaways from this body of work, and they will reflect and have an open discussion about the topic. As in the previous parts of today's program, we invite you to ask your questions in the chat. So our first panelist today, and I'm just going to wait for them to turn on their cameras so you can see everybody. Perfect. Welcome. Our first panelist today is Laura Brunson. Laura is the Deputy Director of the Millennium Water Alliance, and she oversees the organization's work in Ethiopia and Kenya. Our second panelist is Adib Mahmood. Adib is a Managing Director in the Washington, D.C. office of FSG. FSG is a social impact focused consulting firm which works both in the US and internationally. Our third panelist is Ryan Mahoney. Ryan is a WASH advisor at USAID's Center for Water Security, Sanitation and Hygiene. He provides technical assistance to USAID missions around the world. And our final panelist is Louis Burstein. Louis is the Managing Director of the Osprey Foundation, where he leads programs on WASH and sustainable energy. Welcome to all. I'd like to kick things off by asking each of you to respond to the first question. From your perspective as a funder or implementer, what's your interest in collective action approaches? And I'll start with Laura. Laura, you're on mute, by the way.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Lucia. I'm excited to be here with you all today. And we've been working with the SWS team for a couple of years, learning back and forth with them. So it's great to see these closeout events. So from our perspective, I work for the Millennium Water Alliance, and we are a permanent alliance of organizations working in WASH. So for a long time, we've had a vested interest in bringing organizations together to collaborate and to learn from each other. But in more recent years, as we've seen some of the challenges that happen when organizations work in silos across the WASH sector, we've taken that a step further to look more at collective action approaches and more specifically at collective impact, because we believe that by working together and combining key strengths of different organizations, we can do more together than we can independently. And over the last couple of years in various work in East Africa, we've seen a lot of value in utilizing these collective action approaches to work in complex programs. But as we heard from Kimmy, there's still a lot to learn. And we're very interested in continuing to utilize and learn more about collective action approaches and when they're most useful and how to really maximize them. So there you go. Thanks. Back to you, Lucia.
Thanks, Laura. So I think what I think I'm hearing is you're talking about the power of the collective to push through sort of complex problems. Am I correct? That's perfect. Steve, I'm going to pose the same question to you.
Thank you, Lucia, and thanks for inviting me to speak. It's great to see so many participants and follow the great discussion that's happening. As Lucia mentioned, FSG is a social impact-focused research and consulting firm. We're also a nonprofit organization ourselves. And I'll add on to what Laura was saying. This idea of the concept of collective impact that some of you may be familiar with is something that FSG wrote about back in 2011. We didn't come up with collective impact. Other organizations like Strive in the US were already practicing it, but we did give it a framework, called it collective impact, and then we found that there were 5 conditions, including a common agenda and a backbone that were key conditions for collective impact initiatives to thrive. And since then, we've done a study by an independent party also to show that collective impact approaches do create population-based and systems change impacts on a number of different issues. Initially, in the early years, after we wrote about collective impact, when FSG started working on collective impact, the majority of our experiences were in North America. And we felt strongly that it could be applicable to many settings in emerging and developing countries as well. And it's great to hear the examples today, even if they're not using the traditional definition of collective impact, the fact that collective action is happening in WASH settings in sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world. And so over the last few years, we have done more work in collective impact around the world, some focused on WASH. For example, the USHA project that was one of the 11 studies was a project that's focused in Uganda, where we partnered with Tetra Tech to bring a collective impact approach to market-based sanitation nationally in Uganda. And our interest is similar to what Laura was saying, to think about what are the different contexts and settings in which collective impact, or more broadly, collective action, as we're talking about today, can be successful. And are certain factors more important in certain contexts than others, whether it's about a political context or resource constraint setting, or about specific issue areas. And so that's why, I'm here and to both learn and to take part in the conversation, to think about those contexts in which collective action can be most successful.
Thanks, Adib. You've raised an interesting point that I think it's an interesting dimension to this, and I'm sure the audience at some point will have questions, is that you have applied this not just domestically, but you've taken some of those lessons learned and applied that internationally, and I'm sure that will seed some questions for our audience today. Lewis, I want to ask you the same question. I'm going to give you a chance to answer it. Thanks.
Thanks, Lucia. So let me just explain a couple of things up front. Osprey has a major program area in terms of sustainable systems and system strengthening. And as part of that, I should point out that we fund IRC, which is one of the case studies here and a major participant in this. We're a former funder of WAVE. We support something called the WASH Agenda for Change, which involves a dozen or so organizations working in this area. So we are deep into this stuff, and that bias may affect my response here. I should also point out that I sit on the board of IRC, so there's another bias there. Having said that, let me make share a couple of thoughts here. My first thought is wow, and I say wow because the level of discussion on collective action and systems and professionalized maintenance that is going on in this wrap up, and has gone on for the last 5 years in this program, and generally has progressed so much in the WASH sector that it's easy to forget that these were not the discussions that were happening even 3 or 5 years ago. So that is terrific. The second point, Adib mentioned some work that was published by FSG in 2011. I'm going to go back to 2004 when FSG and a professor at the Kennedy School at Harvard, Ron Heifetz, published a piece called Leading Boldly, which talked about the difference between technical and adaptive problems. And as I was listening to the panelists and listening to their experience in trying to support collective action, so much of this is about that point of these are adaptive problems. Technical problems can be solved if we just throw hardware at things. That is part of the solution here, but an enormous part here is the adaptive part, which basically means it involves people. And we, over and over, we've learned that. Now, Lucia, to answer your question directly, Osprey cares about getting people sustainable, affordable wash services that they want to use. We don't know how to get people sustainable wash services if the system that's delivering those services is not functioning. And in many cases, it's very hard to get that system to function if you do not have these sorts of collective action approaches. So we see collective action in many cases, as explained very well in the case studies today, as essential to doing that. The second point and last point I'd make here in response to your question is, as I listen to these to the case studies, and I have been to Cabarole, and I certainly knew Wave's work at the beginning. If you have a really strong program manager, a country manager, a lot of what is being discussed here, they do intuitively. They understand that they have to build these relationships. They understand that they have to work with the government. But what's so great about what the SWS program has done is that you've put some structure to this. You've put some formalized learning to this. And what that means is that people who are not necessarily intuitively or innately capable of looking at this, or don't have as much time, and want to get moving quickly, can learn from the publications, can learn from the experience of these folks, and that should accelerate and I think strengthen the ability to pursue collective action approaches. Thanks.
Thanks, Lewis, for that full disclosure. Thanks for the answer. I think one of the things that I have taken away from your response is that, it's recognizing how essential this is, essential collective action, not only to system change, but to service delivery. Ryan, I'm going to ask the same question to you, pose the same question to you, rather.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, going last, I think have to piggyback on what a lot of the other panelists are saying. I think my interest in collective action is that it works and is necessary to achieve systems change and to achieve the outcomes that we're targeting in water and sanitation. So it's kind of certainly attacking it from that effectiveness perspective. And I think, a lot of these case studies are showing that, yeah, as Lewis said, whether it's more ad hoc or if it's a very systematic collective approach, like what was done with the implementers of sustainable wash systems, it seems like a pretty strong precondition for getting major progress in terms of sustainable progress through on our sector, stakeholders. So think about even just beyond in USAID, I work across lots of different disciplines, and I think there's one angle of citizen accountability, civil society engagement, that actually a lot of these hub structures provide feedback mechanisms that are quite robust in terms of having some accountability in the system as well. So building these up and as well can have broader kind of governance, broader good governance impacts, I think, beyond our sector itself. And then just to be frank, that no one funder has the funding needed to solve the effective nature of it. It certainly tries as well. Happy to continue that conversation about making sure we're leveraging resources as best we can.
Oh, that's great to hear. That's really great to hear. So I'm going to pose the second question to both Adib and Ryan, and we can start with Adib. What would you do differently now that you've read the report and seen the case vignette?
Yeah, I've got two reflections, and this is based on both the case studies as well as what Kimberly was presenting on the 3 pathways to impact. So going back to collective impact that I was talking about, the 5 conditions that we've written about and practiced when we've set up collective impact initiatives are a common agenda, mutually reinforcing activities, continuous communication, shared measurement systems, and a backbone. And obviously, many of these are ones we're hearing about in these case studies as well, especially the hub, which is, sounds like to me is a different name for a backbone, and then common problem solving is what we recommend doing in a common agenda. What was interesting for me, the 2 points that I'd like to think about differently going forward is in the pathways, while the common problem definition was one of the factors, it wasn't a factor in all of the pathways to impact. And it's not terribly surprising. We haven't come to the belief that you have to have all 5 of those conditions to see impact. Certainly there are other pathways to impact. But what I'd like to think about differently is how do you come into a situation where the group feels like they've done enough conversations, that they've looked at data enough, they've interpreted the data enough to have worked through what the problem might be. And so is there a way to actually, jump ahead to the hypotheses for what the solutions might be? That would still be part of what we would call a common agenda. So the common agenda includes both the problems, definition of the problem, as well as what the group needs to do together. But is there a way to not spend as much time on the problem definition if the group feels like they're there? And how do you assess that at the beginning, right? So that's one point that I'd like to think about differently. And then the other is how strongly local government uptake showed up. It was, as Kimberly was saying, it was a critical component in all three pathways to impact, right? And to me, that points out again a couple of issues that are specific to WASH and specific to the developing world, right? So in the U.S., in a lot of in a city or a state or part of a state, you could imagine working on an issue where even if the government hasn't necessarily taken up, so the government might be at the table, but maybe there hasn't been uptake, with enough private philanthropy and private sector and civil society participation, you might still be able to see progress, especially on other issues, right? So water and sanitation, as we've talked about, is inherently something that governments provide. But if it's something like job creation or entrepreneurship, or even healthcare, which in developed markets has a big participation from the private sector, you could imagine seeing a lot of progress without necessarily government uptake. But when it comes to the developing countries, and again with an issue like WASH, it is so critical. So that's something I'd like to think about in the future. What are some of those contexts where you have to have government uptake, which is pretty clear that in this case you do.
That's great to hear. The questions about, what are the key, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, what I'm taking away from this, sort of the key aspects or key components that you need to have for collective action. Do you need to have that common problem identification? SWS, I think it's clear that not necessarily, but also there's this need for local government participation as well in collective action. Ryan, can you respond to the question and perhaps either build or challenge what Adib has given us?
Yeah, I think that just to go off on a little bit of a tangent there with Adib's comment, I think part of what I'm learning from this case study is, from these case studies and the rigorous analysis done, is that, experts don't always, without going through a more systematic process, don't always hit the nail on the head, because I think SWS also did some expert consultations about what factors would be most important in these types of problems. And actually, that common problem identification was like what was a really top priority from those experts, whereas local government support was kind of a medium priority. And I think, by going through the work and doing the rigorous research, we're seeing, at least for the WASH sector, at least for these types of problems, that local government actually, was much more critical in a lot of the cases than the common problem identification. So I think to some degree it's forcing us to check, are necessarily experts on something, and without going through the rigorous process, people who might have the networks and things like that can also, benefit from going through a more systematic look at the system overall and the problems that can come into that. So, that's just an interesting one factor that I'm thinking more about. How do we incorporate this at a more systematic level? And beyond that, I think based on these reports, first of all, it's just great to be able to point to some evidence. So when I'm on a day-to-day basis trying to, inject some aspects of collective action and systems thinking into strategy documents and things like that, it's great to have, lots of resources like SWS has provided, especially this flagship report to point to and, and show as evidence. And as we're collaborating with people across sectors, across disciplines, it's great to have ones that's sector specific. So, thanks.
Thanks, Ryan. It's great to hear that SWS research is adding to the body of evidence, and specifically for the WASH sector. This is great to hear. I'll move on to my next question, and I will pose it to Lewis and Laura. Give me a little while. It'll take a little while to read this one out. So as part of this research, SWS asked teams to estimate the cost to replicate their collective action approach in the neighboring district, using the knowledge they have learned through their cases. Averaged across the cases, the 5-year cost for a district was about 700 days of staff time and $175,000. My question to Lewis and Laura is this cheap or expensive? In other words, at this level of costs, could collective action approaches be implemented everywhere that they are needed? And I'll start with Lewis.
Thanks. I was just doing a little math here, Lucia. So my broad answer to the question is, it's not just the cost, it's the cost and the benefit. And it's very hard to answer that question without knowing what the benefit is. I think, one of the great things of programs like SWS is it surfaces these questions, and then maybe there are further things that need to be studied. So maybe, the next phase of this is to look at these costs and benefits. Having said that, a quick back of the envelope calculation says that $175,000 over 5 years, if my math is right, is $35,000 a year. $35,000 a year, let's say in a district of 300,000 people, is 10 cents per person per year, in order to try to get everybody to work together more effectively, to try to reduce duplication of effort, to try to make sure that funds are moving in the right direction. Seems like a no-brainer to me on the back of the envelope basis, but I think we could do better than that. And I suspect possibly that the team could answer that with a little bit of time and just saying, right, let's look at the benefit that comes out of this as well as the cost.
No, thanks, Lewis. And I see you've thrown a challenge to the team to expand that beyond just the cost, but actually the benefit as well. Thanks for that. Laura, what's your response?
Yeah, Lewis, I like the math. That's quite interesting. And let me add to that a little bit. I 100% agree with Lewis that it's really about the cost-benefit analysis. So if it's and I don't necessarily think that collective action approaches are the end all be all answer in every single circumstance. So, if it's in an area where collective action is not effective, then yeah, that's really expensive and probably isn't helpful. But in a lot of the cases where we've worked, we have seen tangible times when, because of the coordination of the hub and the use of these collective action approaches, duplications were reduced. And one of my key examples is, things that can be really harmful in the sector. So I'm sure most of us have seen examples where, in the same district, one entity is trying to set up a private sector type supply chain for, let's say, water treatment technologies. Meanwhile, another entity is giving those out for free. And that sort of, competing efforts are really unhelpful and can have long-term ramifications. And so if this sort of collaboration and collective action approaches can avoid those challenges, I think that has a huge benefit to progress and to impact. And we haven't ever done any work to actually try to quantify the reduction in duplication or those avoiding those challenges, but I think perhaps you could quantify those and then compare that to the cost of the hub. And then I think there are also some things that would be much harder to quantify, like trust and partnerships and the sort of intangible things that come from those. And then just one other point is also by putting people working together and then advocating with the same messages and a shared voice, I think that's a lot more powerful than any individual organization doing advocacy as just one entity. And I don't know how you quantify that, but I think that also adds a lot of value through the use of collective action approaches. Stop there.
Thanks, Laura. I'm going to switch back to Lewis to see how he responds.
Well, no, I mean, it's nice having, it's nice having fellow panelists like Laura who are much more articulate than I am on why these things matter. So thank you. No, the only point I was going to add is from the perspective of a funder, which is one of the things we've discovered, Osprey has discovered as a funder of both a global hub supporting systems and collective action, the WASH Agenda for Change, but also a number of country programs, whether through the Global Hub or directly. For example, we support the PTPS collaborative in Honduras. It's really hard to get funders to support this stuff. Most funders only want to support direct service delivery. And I think it's worth a moment to explain why Osprey supports this and why we think others should. And the reason I want to say it now is because I think Laura just articulated it perfectly. The amount of money in question is relatively small compared to the overall amount of money spent on service delivery, and particularly if you think the amount of money that's being spent by households and governments and all of the parties, not just the NGOs involved in this work. The amount of money spent on these coordination efforts is very small, and the potential benefit is enormous. It just makes it much more likely that all the rest of the money you're spending is going to be well spent. So a plea, if you will, to other funders to consider the benefits of not just funding the direct service delivery, which is important, but also funding these types of coordination mechanisms, which can make sure that the funds that are spent on service delivery last far longer and do a much better job.
Thank you, Lewis. Please go ahead, Adib. Please go ahead.
Yeah, Lucia, I wanted to add to this. Thank you, first of all, for posing this question, because I feel like often we avoid asking questions about, how does this seem in line, too expensive, too cheap? And thanks for, Lewis, your message. I just underline again, so important for funders to fund the infrastructure of a partnership in addition to the program. So I hope that other funders are also will notice that and jump in. My answer is the same as Lewis's, except instead of the dollar amount, I was looking at it from the person time spent, the 700 days across 5 years, which is about 140 days per year, if that's over 5 years. And the reason I say my conclusion is the same is that also seems cheap, if you will. The way normally we think about collective impact is for the hub to be staffed by 75% to 100% of a full-time equivalent. That can be a one person that can be spread out over multiple people over the course of the initiative. And so, if you do that math, instead of 140 days, depending on how you count working days in a year, that's like 200 days or above in a year. So again, from that perspective, if you're able to get a hub up and running for this number of human days, that seems cheap and definitely seems worth investing in as well.
Yeah, just to bounce in there. I mean, I think cheap, like we said, cheap and expensive is a value proposition. And I think we get a lot of value, as we've seen from these case studies, from collective action approaches. But and I think the comment about service delivery versus collective action and things like that, it's they're mutually reinforcing. As we saw, one of the pathways was external funds. I mean, that would, in many cases, I anticipate would support service delivery. So I think, those are just illustrates how the solution pathways that we've identified in this flagship report are, kind of mutually beneficial in that way. And that in many ways, it's kind of like the projects that are going on need to keep that in mind and think more about how they attack an entire district. I think we see too many projects that are spread thin because they want to hit 25 districts in the country for whatever reason, whether that's the donor, whether that's the ministry, or an impact that the implementer also wants. But I think having the focus to move in on tackle an entire district, and then these costs become, you're really able to see the benefits from all these costs when the coalitions form and can have impact more broadly beyond the project, beyond the life of the project. That's all.
And if I could just jump in briefly, I'd like to add on to what Adib was saying. Adib, I appreciate that you went back to the man hours, or the person hours, excuse me, and really kind of made that point in addition to the actual financial cost. While we might argue that having collective approaches takes a fair amount of time from government partners to really engage repeatedly in meetings and workshops and discussions and visioning activities and things like that, I also could make an argument that in the long run, it saves them a lot of time, because instead of having to liaise on an individual basis with lots of different programs and lots of different partners, government can really liaise with the hub and have that consistent partner and consistent messages and one consistent vision, which I think in the long run, the feedback we've heard is that government partners really appreciate that and find that it does make their job easier and more efficient instead of having all these different partners. And the other point on the person hours is that we've also heard a lot of feedback, and I assume that the folks from SWS have gotten this also, is that people really like working this way. They like having strong, trusted partnerships and working together with other entities in a nicely coordinated and consistent manner. And so I think that also energizes people and helps to motivate them. So I think there's also an intangible cost savings there that we could add to the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks for this. And we have a very interesting and good point that's come in from Rebecca in the chat, and I'm going to repeat it here. She says that I think one of the challenges in getting donors to change their funding priorities is the need to have metrics to show progress or benefit, and the need to justify investments. For example, USAID metrics can sometimes be challenging to navigate and don't always allow for emphasis on this sort of work because they're hard to quantify. And I'm going to say that, before I move on to the next question, Ryan or Lois, do you want to respond to this?
Sure. I mean, I think I'm not sure which, project or metrics that they're referring to, but it's definitely, this is part of collective action. We're not doing for the sake of doing collective action. It's to see these outcomes come about. And we have a new suite of indicators on governance and financing that I think would definitely be appropriate for collective impact, collective action approaches. beyond just number of people gaining new access. So, we're working in those directions to try to capture how, local governments are improving their capacity, improving their engagement, mobilizing funding in some cases. It's, something we're definitely working towards. But, this is part of a holistic, there's no two bones about it. There is, we're trying to expand access. People need these services. So it's not a function of either or, but I think they can come together. And I think far too much emphasis has been on the expanding access in the past, and moving towards these system strengthening approaches is the direction that we're moving.
Let me add a couple of thoughts to what Ryan just said. And understanding that the question is in itself about at least an hour-long session to discuss. So I guess the first point is that it is clearly official funding agencies need to be able to measure outcomes. That's really important. They have to be able to report back to their parliaments or congresses in order to help explain what's happened to the public funds. So I don't think we're going to get away from that. I think, as Ryan said, what we need to do is add to that. And so we don't just need to measure the what, we need to measure the how. And one of the great things about this program is it's starting to help us learn how to measure the how, whether it's network analysis, or any one of a number of other tools that have been explored here. So we need both, and we need to get. We're okay at measuring outcomes, although even there we tend to measure them statically instead of dynamically, and we measure them, because it's easier to do that, and we don't necessarily measure the sustainability of those outcomes. So it's not about access, it's about sustainable services, and we have to measure sustainable services. And then we want to measure, as Ryan said, the strength of the system also. The second point, and it relates to what I would call the contribution versus attribution problem, which is that a lot of funders really need to be able to attribute to their activities the certain outcomes, and that is often really quite counterproductive when it comes to working in a systems way, and certainly in a collective action way. And so if we can figure out metrics that are not just about measuring the progress made based on somebody's particular dollars, but rather on the progress made across the district or across the country, and then allocating that as a contribution to different funders, I think that would make an enormous difference in the way this works. Because honestly, and if you look at the final report here, or at least the draft of the final report that I've seen, the largest set of recommendations is for funders, which is sort of interesting. Funders are often the problem, and we need to move away from the situation where funders are the problem to the situation where funders are actually well aligned with sustainable service delivery and something that's about contribution and not attribution.
Thanks for that. I think the contribution-attribution conundrum is I think many of us in the audience are well aware of it, or certainly have had first-hand experience with it. I'd like to open it up to the panelists and ask you what is one question you would like to ask each other? And any one of you can start off.
I guess I'll jump in. I mean, I have my response to this, but I think one thing I hear when we're talking about collective action and systems approaches is people might say, like, this is just some responses I get, people say this is just good development. This is just, apart from the fact that I don't know how to put good development in a scope of work or a project document, how do you respond to those kind of critiques where they say, oh, you just need to hire the right person, and they'll know all the players, and this is overly expensive way of attacking that problem. Maybe does any of the panelists feel like they have a good response to that critique I hear sometimes?
I could start, I think, Ryan. That's a really great question, and I hear that sometimes too. But I think a couple of things. One is that it's very intentional. So, yeah, in the sector, we like to say, oh, we should all partner together. We should stop working in silos. But it's really easy to say that and then to sort of put a loose partnership together. But I think the use of collective action approaches are much more intentional. So it's intentionally having a hub that's going to serve specific roles across the entire partnership. And it's intentionally convening together on a regular, consistent basis and having this shared vision. And so, you might get loose partnerships that do some of those pieces, but I think this is much more intentional. And so I think that's one answer. And then the second point, but I lost it. So I'm going to stop now and let somebody else jump in.
Lewis, any questions, any responses? Adib?
Well, mine's not a question for the panelists, although I'm sure we could do that for several more hours. But when I think of the many people who joined this call and who are on, if you're a funder, I would echo some of the messages we've been hearing about throughout this panel, which is, please consider funding whatever you want to call it, the backbone or the hub or the infrastructure. There is a critical need for funding the partnership itself in addition to programs. Many funders will talk about systems change. It is very rare that system change happens through isolated impact and through organizations working by themselves. And if organizations are going to come together to work in a structured, collaborative way, there needs to be some funding available for gathering them together, for planning the agenda, for making sure they're all reading from the same book, so to speak. And if you're an implementer, whether you are part of an existing coalition or are thinking of joining one, then please consider how not just you're going to be attending the meetings, but how is your programmatic strategy going to change as a result of you being part of the coalition? What does that look like versus if you are working by yourself?
Lucia, the only thing I would add to that is what I've learned from studying collective action efforts in other areas is very much echoes what Adib just said, which is at some point you really need to subsume your organizational goals for the greater goals of the collective effort. And that's very hard to do for the contribution versus attribution reasons and a bunch of others. But the really effective collective action efforts actually have everybody pulling together. And I think it goes back to that wonderful graphic of the fish all swimming in a different direction as opposed to the fish forming one big fish and moving in the right direction. It's hard to do, but boy, when it happens, it's great. And I guess the only other thing I'd say is, and this is from the perspective of a funder, not an implementer, it's pretty easy to tell that it's working when you visit. Now, as a funder, it's, I do a lot of visits, or I used to do a lot of visits up until a couple of years ago. And I visited Cabaroli a couple of years ago, and it's clear when the efforts of organizations are in service of the government, are in service of the collective good, as opposed to just being out there to do their own thing. And Laura was much more articulate about the benefits and the reasons to do this than I could be. But it's not very hard to tell when it's working or when it's not if you just bother to go out and have a look.
I think with that, I will say thank you. Thank you to all. It's been fantastic having you on here as a panelist. I think you've given us a lot of food for thought in terms of, understanding the value and the importance of collective action in any of the approaches that were any of our work. Actually, it's critical to service delivery. And I also thank you for posing some challenges to us to go back and ask some of the right questions. It's not about the cost; it's about the cost benefit. I think with that, I will say thank you very, very much. I can see our chat was pinging. And Lois, like you, I think I missed the days when we could all see each other and travel a little bit. I think this would have been an interesting and lively discussion if we'd all done this in person. I can see the chat pinging again. But thank you very much. Thanks to all the panelists for this. And with that, I will hand over to our Chief of Party, Brittany.
Okay. Thanks, Lucia. And yes, thanks. That was a really great panel discussion. So I'm just going to run through a couple slides, and I will be able to wrap up in the next 5 minutes. So we can go to the next slide. I want to share just 2 resources on this topic, but do want to remind everyone that SWS has published over 100 resources, and these can all be found on our Global Waters page at www.globalwaters.org/SWS. For those that want to learn more about collective action, our flagship report is literally hot off the press. This was just published yesterday, and I highly recommend taking a look if you want to dig into Kimmy's findings a little deeper, as well as read up on our recommendations. We also have a companion journal article that was recently published in Science of the Total Environment, so we'll share the links to both of these resources in the chat. I hope you'll all join us for our final session tomorrow. We have Chip Walker from USAID's Bureau for Policy Planning and Learning, who will provide a keynote address. We'll also summarize key findings and recommendations from the 3 deep dive sessions, and we'll end with a World Cafe so that you have the opportunity to select from a few new topics, including securing government commitment for collective action, which has already been plugged during this session, as well as using outcome mapping to measure systems change, which I think gets at a little bit at the measuring the how, picking up on that thread from the panel discussion. So I promise you'll learn something new tomorrow, and we'll share the link to register if you're not already signed up. Hope to see all of you there. Now that you've all attended at least one of our deep dive sessions, we'd love if you could fill out a quick 1-question survey. You'll be answering the question here in the blue box, and our goal with this survey is to explore how you, our participants of this closeout event, conceptualize the factors and their interconnections that are critical for supporting sustainable WASH services. So please take just a minute to fill this out. We'll be sharing some preliminary results during tomorrow's session, so that should be quite interesting to see. Next slide, please. Great. So lastly, I just want to thank our session leads, Peabody and Lucia Henry. We've listed their email addresses here on this slide if you'd like to get in touch. I would also like to thank Elizabeth, Muhammad, and Martin for sharing their experiences with applying collective action approaches in Ethiopia and Uganda, as well as our fantastic panel for their insights on this topic. We appreciate all of our attendees for joining us today and the very active discussion in the chat. We continue to be so thankful for all of the great questions coming in and all of the interaction. And we hope to see all of you tomorrow for our final session. So that's it. Goodbye for now, and hope to see you tomorrow when we bring everything together.